Early in my own explorations, it became clear to me that in order for a teaching to have value, it must have a well-developed practical side. It must be useful for me personally, applicable in my daily life. It must introduce me to new facts about myself, facts that will help me shed useless suffering. If we explore New Age literature, and a great deal of the teachings from the popular gurus in the East and these days in the West, we cannot help but notice they're essentially hypnotic feel-good themes, platitudes, and appeals to our divine nature. You are divine as you are. All is well. You don't need to do anything. Just float as the river carries you to the boundless ocean, and so on. Orthodox Christian ideas are scarcely better. Believe in Jesus, and by the grace of God you will enter eternal paradise. At least this doctrine comes with a stick. Disregard the teaching of Jesus, and you will burn in hell for all eternity. This, at least, gives us some incentive to modify our superficial behaviour, gild a better mask. These ideas are comforting and reassuring. And while this is all some people are looking for, these kind of teachings, generally speaking, do nothing to facilitate self-knowledge. They do not introduce us to disowned aspects of our psychology. They disregard the necessity for change, or they see psycho-spiritual growth as a largely organic, effortless process. But altogether, these mainstream religious and spiritual teachings are just very pleasant daydreams, and this is what makes them so very popular. If we find in ourselves things that need to change in order for our quality of life to improve, then we quickly realise that real change is much more difficult than we ever imagined. Knowing what needs to change is one thing, actually changing things in any real way is another. Over the course of our lives, we develop habitual ways of thinking, habitual ways of feeling, habitual behaviours that become so deeply entrenched that as soon as our attention wavers from the task, we find ourselves thinking as we usually think, feeling as we usually feel, and behaving just as we did before. And so our efforts to change amount to nothing. This underlines the necessity for a well-developed, verifiable, practical side to a psycho-spiritual teaching. In the previous video, we looked at the individual from a psychological point of view and discovered that Jung and Freud's schematics conform to those we find in religious ideology and, at a fundamental level, the world of physics. Earlier in this series, I spoke about the equivalency between psychological and spiritual growth, that they represent different expressions of the same thing. You might recall that in French the word for mind is l'esprit, the spirit, and the word for mind in German is Geist, that is, ghost. The Holy Spirit, then, refers to the holy mind, and spiritual growth refers to psychological growth. The works of Jung, Freud, Gurdjieff, the teachings of Jesus, both from an orthodox and heterodox perspective, Dostoevsky's book, Notes from the Underground, and many other sources speak of the individual's bifurcated psyche, the necessity of integrating the contents of the unconscious with a conscious mind so as to cultivate a more tenable and realistic concept of self. But to what extent are we able to do this? By what means? How is it beneficial to us? What will we contend with along the way, and where will this lead us? Gurdjieff and Dostoevsky in particular give especially good accounts of this, Dostoevsky with much more humour. Last time I left off with a few questions about this saying of Jesus. Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all. One meaning of this saying refers to the seeking out of the contents of the unconscious. But this is not so simple by definition. We can only grope around in the pitch black of this psychic labyrinth as we try to identify those things we come across, as we attempt to bring to the surface whatever we find there so we can see them properly. Psychological causes that we do not understand and cannot explain are often attributed to the unconscious, and Gurdjieff once described it as a pit into which anything can be thrown. In spite of this, both the esoteric literature of antiquity and modern academic psychology have identified important features of the unconscious that are now generally accepted. In particular, those aspects of self which have been repressed, and especially those which have been repressed because they do not conform to the imaginary self-image our parents and teachers believe they embody and measure us by. This process of concealing one's true self from others and eventually oneself begins very early in life and is perpetuated from generation to generation. Repressed features of our psychology contrast those attitudes and behaviours that we are expected to have, and over the course of time convince ourselves that we actually do have. So they cannot exist together with a positive representation of ourselves, which ordinarily becomes more heavily reinforced as we reach adulthood. At the same time, the negative aspects of self become more deeply disowned as they fade into the darkness of the unconscious. And as they fade away, it becomes ever more difficult and painful for us to bring them back into the light. If we have no real interest in psycho-spiritual development, then diving into the dark realms of our unconscious material is a hiding to nothing. The aspects of self that dwell there were repressed for good reasons. They were antithetical to our inherited religiously flavoured moral and ethical heritage, condemned and vilified. So we build defences around them. We create ways to hide them from ourselves and others, and even if they do surface, we find ways to justify them according to our imaginary self-image. All of this means that ordinarily we are mostly blind to at least half of our own psychology. Jung and Freud saw advantage with uncovering this material and eventually accepting this disowned psychological content so as to cultivate a more realistic and integrated picture of oneself. That this course of action would at least alleviate the inner and outer conflicts our bifurcated psyche creates, and it is hard to argue against this point of view. The integration of the repressed features of our psyche represents substantial psychological growth in the view of modern psychology, but from the point of view of esoteric religious literature, it merely puts one in a position to begin psycho-spiritual growth. Russian philosopher P.D. Uspensky sums up the idea nicely. He says that we cannot try to begin to do any work on an imaginary self. We can only begin to work on an authentic self, and this of course requires, first of all, the destruction of the idealized self-image. The dismay Jesus speaks of in the saying is a less dramatic descriptive term than others have described it. Gurdjieff, Dostoevsky, and more ancient esoteric religious sources use terms like horror, and this corresponds to my own experience. In the aftermath of my own epiphany, as my intense self-loathing slowly abated, I consoled myself that in spite of my newfound inglorious nature, that at least I had achieved something useful, something that was already softening my judgments of others. In reality, I could not claim even this much, because happenstance cleared the way into the abyss ahead of me. The only work I did was to escape my own suffering, which I could not bear, and find my way back out again, because I had no other choice. I had no choice but to accept the undeniable reality of these disowned but characteristic aspects of self, and over a long time it became less difficult as I began to find humour in them. I realised that I was not unusually awful and shameful, that others were much the same, and that they suffered endlessly and uselessly by avoiding the useful suffering involved with cultivating a more realistic self-image. It was in this context that Jesus said, "If you had suffered, you would know how not to suffer. Suffer then, that you may learn how not to suffer." The crucified Jesus, amongst other things, is a symbolic representation of this idea. It represents the painful death of the idealized self-image. Suffering, as Dostoevsky, Gurdjieff, and the teachings attributed to Jesus, is an indispensable part of reintegrating the disowned features of self, pre-requisite and inevitable. And this explains a general reluctance to go anywhere near it. Somewhere in our psyche, a faint voice implores us not to go there, that only pain will follow. And I have known people that would literally faint rather than confront hidden features of themselves. So what advantage is there from all this suffering? Well, in the first place, we discover that our psychic lives are much richer than we supposed, that all kinds of different characters, figures, or we could even look at them as different people, lurk within us. In humanistic, transpersonal and ego psychology, these different characters are described as subpersonalities, and it is supposed that there may be a dozen of them. These subpersonalities are described as functional self-presentations that navigate particular psychosocial situations, or temporary personality modes that allow a person to cope with certain psychosocial situations. Esoteric religious literature, the character that speaks in Dostoevsky's book, and the literature of Gurdjieff have a slightly different point of view. The story of a figure called Legion, meeting Jesus in the Bible, is a good example. Legion is a multitude of people within the person, a multitude of personal demons inhabiting the individual unconscious. Gurdjieff offers a more pithy and interesting representation. He likewise sees the individual as a multitude of very different characters, who from one moment to the next take centre stage and beats down all the other characters with a stick. Then another grabs a stick and beats down the rest, and then another, and so on, and so on. This, according to Gurdjieff, is a representation of our entire psychic life. Any slight change in the external world evokes one self or another, and that every particular self, for as long as it lasts, occupies the whole of us. Dostoevsky, Plato, and several others besides have similar points of view and routinely allegorize the psyche as a city, a household full of servants. The vastly disparate individuals that we find in society of the outside world as a representation of the society that resides within us, complete with the cruel, the petty, the children, the thieves, the liars, the adulterers, the vain, the arrogant, the self-righteous, the sages, teachers, the police, the sycophants, the perverse, the puerile, and so on and so on. Gurdjieff said that if we could see the inhabitants of our inner world, we would not need to go to the theatre, and I would tend to agree. Dostoevsky highlights another form of suffering we eliminate through the integrated self, that it becomes increasingly difficult to be angry or feel violently towards others, to accuse them of all kinds of unbecoming behaviours, since, in finding all these things in ourselves without mistake, and realising how difficult it is to be aware of them and to own them, our objections dissolve into nothing. This brings to mind another idea that we find everywhere in esoteric literature. When you point the finger, remember the other 3 fingers are pointed at yourself. So it becomes increasingly difficult to accuse other people and easier to find compassion instead. In religious texts, the devil is known as the accuser, but this is a metaphor for the consequences of our bifurcated psyche. The devil is, in fact, the self-blindness that enables us to do this, and the accuser is only defeated through the integration of our psychologically disowned material, the realization that the cause of our psychological suffering cannot be attributed to others or the events of the external world, but rather that all psychological causes are in us. Luke 6:42, Jesus said, "How can you say, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, while you yourself fail to see the beam in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the beam out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Along the same lines he said, "For with whatever judgment you judge, you will be judged, and with whatever measure you measure, it will be measured to you." And then with greater clarity still in Romans 2, verse 1, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on another. For on whatever grounds you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." In fact, we find endless examples on the value attributed to integrating the disowned contents of our psyche everywhere in orthodox and heterodox religious literature. Only we are not used to understanding the teachings of Jesus as psychological in character, or we regard ideas like this as glib. And this is convenient, as it keeps us alienated from those things we cannot and ordinarily do not want to see. The comedic farce of our ordinary psychological situation is also something to marvel at for another reason. While the demons, monsters, and unsavoury creatures that reside in our unconscious are quite real aspects of ourselves, the virtues we ascribe to ourselves, in contrast, are mostly imaginary and exist as ideals only. So our virtue signalling is as funny as it is revealing. Now we can move to the last idea in this saying of Jesus, "and will reign over all." At the moment we are at the mercy of the unrecognised aspects of our unconscious, which enable us to accuse others, to feel hurt by them, to attack others, and they cause us sufferings in all kinds of ways, to act against our own interests, to destroy in a moment things that have taken a long time to build, to crucify others, and we have no control over this. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." So the benefits of integrating at least this material of the unconscious is that we will in time notice different inhabitants of the unconscious rise to the surface and speak. Instead of them taking us over and causing all kinds of damage, we will progressively find ways to deal with them individually. This one, we can track back to its birth and realise it no longer serves a useful purpose. That one, we can let out to plain full view and laugh at. Others, we only need to acknowledge to take away their power over us. In this way, we will come to rule over all of them, instead of them ruling over us. Thanks for listening.